Trust is trying to communicate with people. I'm going to try and talk for about half an hour, 45 minutes on nature's recovery. We're also Zooming live across the internet tonight to people who are dialing in remotely. So if I keep looking down at the laptop, it's trying to engage them as well as you guys in the room. This talk is at times fairly depressing, if I'm honest, because the state of nature is not great. But it has a happy ending, hopefully, or an inspirational uplift at the end. So if after the first few slides you're thinking, this is a bit heavy for an evening talk, then hopefully it will pick up as we move on. So the story starts in so many ways in 1970. So I like to set the scene when I'm doing talks of this nature, just to sort of cast our minds back, if you were around then, and if you weren't then, give you an insight into what life was like. If you lived in Kettering at the time, that's what the town centre looked like. You know, Kettering was a lovely place then, and it's a lovely place now. Not relevant to the rest of this talk, but just a nice sort of scene setter. And if you're a gentleman on a Friday night, you might have dressed like that to go outside and entertain the ladies. And the ladies might have looked a bit like that on a Friday night in Kettering town centre. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I'm sure they did. And you probably can't read it, but that's a football table which shows that back in 1970, Coventry City were quite good, and Manchester City not so good. And essentially, that's the kind of the base for this talk, that a lot has changed since then in football and in nature. So it's the last time I'm going to mention football, just in case you hate football. But it starts off the talk because Warwickshire Wildlife Trust were established back in 1970. So the foundations of the charity start before then. Passionate local volunteers in the local area worked at a regional level at that time across the West Midlands area. But around 1969, 1970, they established the charity that still exists today. So fast forward 50 years and 5 decades, an awful lot has been achieved in that time. And the context for this talk is the demonstration that as an organisation, we've not been alone in trying to support nature during that period. Lots of people, individuals, other environmental charities, government agencies have done lots of stuff to help nature. And it's important to remember in the context of where we are that if none of that work had happened, nature would have been in a far worse state than it is now. So over the next 5 decades, the charity started to acquire nature reserves. They started to become a bit more professionalised, I guess. They started to employ their first members of staff, opened Brandon Marsh Nature Centre up near Coventry, did a lot of environmental education work, engaging children, and set up an environmental consultancy, Middlemarch Environmental, back in 1998. And then in the last few decades, the growth of the charity has increased significantly. Today, we now employ 75 members of staff within the charity, manage 65 nature reserves covering about 1,000 hectares of land, and deliver tens of thousands of educational activities to young children and communities. We've reintroduced dormice into woodlands and helped return the otters to rivers across Warwickshire where they were formerly extinct. But all of that is essentially a sort of swimming against the tide, if you like, as I said earlier, along with other people, passionate individuals and local groups, other charities. The state of nature, unfortunately, during that period, and that's why we started in 1970, because the official records for recording species started around then to accurately benchmark them. And since the point of 1970, pretty much all of the graphs go down. So even if you're not a mathematician, if the graphs go down, it doesn't tend to be very good. There are some species, obviously, that buck that trend, and there are some sort of generalist species that are doing very well. Deer, for example, population has been on the increase for some time. And that's mainly because they're highly mobile, can move across the landscape fairly easily, get from place to place, and they can adapt what they eat. However, for the majority of species that happen to live in the UK, they have carved out a niche over generations, really, developing a real focus to where they live or how they feed, how they breed, etc., etc. And fundamentally, human impact has started to challenge the way in which they function. And as a result, the majority of species in the UK are going in the wrong direction. And that points us to a place where we are today, where 15% of all of our wildlife is under threat from extinction, which is a scary stat, quite frankly. I've worked in the environmental sector now for about 2 decades, and I intend to try and work in it for the rest of my career. If I get to retirement age and I've overseen 15% of the extinction of all species in the UK, then I will have failed in my job. And it's quite a depressing fact to kind of face for somebody who works in this sector, that we are heading in that direction unless we fundamentally change the way humans behave. Now, the reason behind that is really, really complex, and that's a whole nother talk, really, in terms of the impact of humanity on nature. There's such a variety of different factors, and different factors influence different species depending on where the species are found. But broadly speaking, it's the way we grow our food, it's the way we build houses and construct, it's the lack of sustainability to a lot of the things that we've started to implement over the last few decades, which has started to put the pressure on the species that we have here. And I did give you a bit of a warning at the start. It's not a very uplifting start to the talk, and it continues, unfortunately. So the UK has been assessed against 218 countries around the world to assess its biodiversity intactness. And essentially what that is a sort of a baseline assessment of how natural that country is. So the more a country's landscape and the land in it has been altered, either for agriculture or for human development in other ways, golf courses or towns and urban development, the more changes are made, the more sort of the intactness level goes down. So we are now ranked 189th out of 218 countries in the world, which is a shocking statistic. And you know, that's partly because we're a small island and there's a lot of us and there's physically not enough space. You know, some of the other countries that are way ahead obviously have far lower populations or much bigger land areas. But it's been inherent in the way in which we have developed the UK over the last few decades that the environmental considerations have had a back foot in sort of in place of economic driven decisions, short-term economic decisions. And in Warwickshire, we're really blessed with a lot of data. So we've got a project called the Habitat Biodiversity Audit. That is a team within my department whose job is to go out and survey the land across the county. So they work across Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull. This is a map of Stratford district. And they've been working on a project recently to look at ancient woodlands. So ancient woodlands are the historic woodlands in the UK. So anything essentially that was on the first maps when they started to produce them around 1600. So if a woodland was mapped on that map then, and it's still there now, it's regarded as an ancient woodland. It might not be the same trees, because sometimes over time they chop the trees down and they may have replanted them. So they're not all ancient or veteran trees in the wood. But those woodlands have had long-term tree cover, which is really important for biodiversity. So the green, you can't quite see it from the back of the room probably, but the green areas on the map are long established woods, a new category that we've developed through this process, which are not quite ancient woodlands, but they've still been around for a long time. The blue ones on the map are the existing ancient woodlands, and the red dots are the ones that we've lost. And we have lost 33 ancient woodlands across Stratford district alone since 1889. And that covers about 236 hectares, so 236 football pitches roughly of woodland that we've lost during that time. For a variety of different reasons, sometimes to improve the land for farming, sometimes to build houses, sometimes to build roads, etc., etc. So a local example really of the reduction in overall habitat and naturalness that we have in Stratford, which is, you know, synonymous with the rest of the county. One of the challenges with that is that the remaining areas that we have, so this is an orbit housing estate, which is in Stratford, and in what it shows there, well, it's a very jazzy looking picture. The red and white stripes and the red and white other patterns are effectively the houses, the built up areas, the hard standing. And the green bits are the wild areas, if you like, and the black dots are trees. Unfortunately, in that housing estate, like so many others, all of the grass is amenity grassland, the sort of grass you would find on a football pitch or a park. And therefore, its wildflower diversity or any kind of diversity is next to zero. It's just grass and ryegrass at that. So from a biodiversity point of view, one of the challenges we have is when we have developed sites, we've not thought about trying to retain what's already there or trying to improve it for nature as we've gone along. So we're left with this legacy of fairly condensed, high density developments in some areas, and the natural areas have been eroded and replaced often in what we perceive to be tidy or other grassland areas that are easy to keep clean. And that's a challenge for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that disconnect with nature. So this map here shows an aerial view of that housing estate that I just showed you. This is a pink blob in the middle, and that's on the sort of the western edge of Stratford. To the sort of western side, you've got the yellow fields, the light yellow fields are all arable. The orangey coloured fields are the wilder, more native grasslands, the undisturbed grasslands. So you've got quite a nice scattering, but not as many as the other representations of either urban area or arable across that picture. And there is also a disconnect between the sort of affluence of the area and the connection to nature. So in more deprived areas where there are higher concentrations of buildings, there is less access to green space. And that creates a further disconnect for communities who are living in those areas to be able to connect with nature, because they often lack the transport or the ability to travel far to get to a green space, and therefore interacting with nature isn't part of their daily lives. Whereas in more affluent areas, there are perhaps a larger amount of natural spaces incorporated, and those people also have the cars and the ability to travel. The new kid on the block with all this, and something that's in the news a lot at the moment, is climate change and the impact of climate change. And climate change on the climate emergency is a serious threat to humanity in its own right. But one of the things that is perhaps less connected in the media is the impact of climate change on our natural world, and the ecological emergency and the climate emergency and how they interact. We've done studies with universities that show if we just go through a 2-degree warming across Warwickshire, this is the percentage of different groups that are likely to be impacted by that 2-degree warming process. And at the moment, based on all of the international government discussions, we are sort of sliding in that direction through a lack of emergency at a strategic national level. So fundamentally, this is a huge problem because although some of those species on there, people are like, well, what does it matter if we lose a few millipedes, or I don't actually know how many centipedes there are. But those things are at the base of the food chain. And if you remember being at school and learning about food chain and how interconnected everything is, as soon as you start to lose some of the things that are perhaps lesser known and maybe don't even have an English name and they're all sort of Latin names and they're all brown and look a bit the same, they're the things that get eaten by lots of other stuff. So even if we don't know what they are, or we don't necessarily care about them as much as some of the more iconic species, they are fundamental to the rest of it. And a great sort of way of showing that is the hedgehog. Everyone knows hedgehogs, hopefully. So this is a map of Rugby. We had a project in Rugby a couple of years ago where we asked people to record hedgehogs. So all the dots on the map are hedgehogs. The blue dots, if you can make them out, are the hedgehogs that were seen alive. The purple ones, unfortunately, squashed mainly by cars. And the orange ones were, I saw a hedgehog, but I didn't know whether it was dead or alive, or didn't tell us. So that's not too significant in terms of this story. We had lots of sightings, but the crucial part of it really is this journey that a hedgehog has to go on. So hedgehogs are quite complex creatures. They have quite a variety of different food sources at different times of the year. So they eat earthworms all year round. But if you imagine earthworms live in the soil, during the summer it's too hard to get them out. During the winter it's too hard to get them out. So there are significant times of the year, if a hedgehog is around, even if it wakes up from hibernation, it can't access food. So hedgehogs are typically around between April and October. Obviously, normally they hibernate for the rest of the period, but sometimes if we have a freak warm spell, like we did the other year in February, they will wake up. And the challenge that hedgehogs face is that the food availability they have beyond earthworms is not around all year. So they might really like the taste of weevils, but weevils are really only a prey for them in May. So once the weevil population has gone through, they need to find something else to eat. So hedgehogs have evolved to eat a variety of different things. Now, if you take out, for example, weevils, if weevils are one of the species that are impacted by climate change and suddenly there's no more weevils, day to day, we probably wouldn't notice. But for a hedgehog, that means it might not have any food between April and June. And that could be enough to kill off the hedgehogs. So that's the complexity that we're dealing with, is that we don't fully, and hedgehogs are well studied in comparison to other species, don't fully understand the interrelationships between all these species. And if we start to lose some of the lesser known ones, it could have a snowball effect. And the other thing to say about hedgehogs, and this is a study that we didn't do but was undertaken elsewhere, this is a golf course on the edge of an urban area, and they tagged hedgehogs and watched to see where they go. And a male hedgehog averaged 1.8 kilometers per night. So the idea that you've got a hedgehog in your garden is slightly poetic in terms of how it operates. Now, it may be in your garden, it may come back, and it may sleep under your shed, but it's certainly not just spending its time in your garden all night, unless you've got the most diverse garden that it can cater for all its food needs. But most hedgehogs are covering huge areas just to find that food supply. And that's a challenge and sort of symptomatic of the challenges that species face, because hedgehogs rely on being able to move through the landscape, and the way in which we put walls around our gardens or fences or put roads across makes it more challenging for a hedgehog to move. On a golf course, obviously, there's no cars. If there's another hedgehog half a mile to the north, he's got to cross umpteen roads and go around umpteen fences, and that's going to make it much more challenging. And the reality of that is, it's not an exaggeration to say that we are on the verge of the next global mass extinction, because the UK is not unique in this situation. This is faced all around the world with endemic species that are found in different countries. And fundamentally, because it's all interconnected, we need to find a way of becoming more sustainable in how we act as a society. So one of the challenges, and possibly why you're here tonight, is because you're interested in the environment. My job is to try and convince and engage people sometimes that aren't, and think, well, what does it really matter? As long as I can eat, then it's fine. Actually, nature, the natural world, provides everything that we actually need, whether it be clean air and water, whether it be regulating pests and diseases, whether it be providing soil to grow food in, or the mental and physical health benefits of being outdoors. So one of the things that I often use as a tool in our armory when we're trying to engage difficult audiences is not actually starting with nature, but thinking about the fundamental things that matter to them, whether it be food or clean air or what makes their business tick. And often the environment is underpinning that, although it's not obvious to them. And put another way, if you imagine all of the blocks in a giant Jenga tower to be a different species, the challenge we're facing is that if the humans are the top block, if you start taking out some of the blocks below, at some point, they're all going to fall down. Humans being on the top are going to be impacted, whether we like it or not, by the removal of species across this earth. And it's when we get to that tipping point that we're not quite sure when that's going to be, quite frankly. So this is the bit where we should go a bit more upbeat, and hopefully there's hope. So well done for sticking with me during that period of scene setting. So despite a lot of good work by volunteers, by individuals, by organisations to try and support nature over the last 5 decades, it has been in decline. And if we carry on essentially doing what we're doing, over the next few decades, it will eventually end up in extinction as a species. And we might get to a snowball effect where, unfortunately, it's not reversible. However, we have a choice. The brilliant thing about this is we know what to do. There's a lot of studies out there that shows how you can reverse nature's decline. And there are species that are sort of beacons of hope, like the otter, which was once extinct on rivers in Warwickshire and has come back. So the fundamental challenge that we face is to ensure that environmental thinking is incorporated into everything that we do, and not just something that a charity that does the environment does. So the Wildlife Trust nationally are stepping up to the challenge, because we've concluded that essentially if we don't do something drastic by 2030, society is going to be in real trouble. We might be at that point then where there's no return. So from our perspective, the focus is trying to fundamentally change as much as we can others' behaviour by 2030. And the sort of the definition of success, or when we know we'll have achieved it, is if we can get 30% of the area of the UK land and sea to be supporting nature in a way that is more effective. Because what happens when you get to 30%, essentially, is you start to have enough connectivity in the landscape for things like hedgehogs or other species to move. And at the moment, we're not at that level. And as a result of that, you have these kind of islands where species are sort of isolated. And if you are a hedgehog and you're trying to find a lady hedgehog across town to have a family, you have to cross barriers in the landscape, roads and other things to get there. If we can improve that connectivity, those hedgehogs are much more likely to breed and to continue the population. The other part for us is a concept called Team Wilder. I'm going to talk about how we're achieving all this and your role and you can play in that in a minute. So the obvious first question might be, well, okay, if we want to get to 30%, well, where are we at now? And depending on who you listen to, you get a very different answer for that. So we got very excited a while ago when Boris Johnson stood up and said, 30% sounds like a good idea, we're going to do that. But his next sentence was, we're already really going well on that track. And thanks to our national parks, we are well on the way to hitting 30%, which unfortunately is a bit of false information, because the national parks are I'm not getting political here, but the national parks are a land designation. So they are a designation of a landscape and not a designation of protected areas for nature. So you can live in a national park and still intensively farm. And there's nothing in law against that. And that's, you know, for places like Snowdonia, there is intensive sheep grazing. That's not particularly great for wildlife. It's a lovely scenic area, but it's not full of nature as it would be described by the current Prime Minister. So we are some way off 30%. And as I said, in Warwickshire, we're quite lucky because we know where we're at. So we have this baseline data. So we have at field level mapped every field across the county, and we are carrying out a rolling program of updating that map. So if somebody plants some new wildflowers or a new woodland or builds a housing estate, we try and keep up with the progress that's happening. And that gives us a snapshot of where we think we roughly are. And unfortunately, it's not great news, as you'd expect. So Stratford's actually doing quite well in comparison to some of the other areas. We estimate Stratford district's at about 16%. And that's 16% of natural areas. So that might be parks that are owned by the council that have got areas of unintensive sort of not amenity grassland in them. It might be farmers that are doing environmental schemes. It might be woodlands. It might be nature reserves and other bits, roadside verges, things like that. What we've not been able to include in those figures is wildlife gardens, because that's quite hard to measure at that scale. But we do think that there might be some overlap where something might be a nature reserve and also something else, and therefore we probably think on balance that's about right. And if you look at, say, for example, so this is Stratford again, you can start to see, so on here we've got the dark green area, which is the Heart of England forest. Then you've got the sort of areas that are connecting that and designated areas with a buffer applied. And the idea behind the buffer is, okay, well, if we start to influence neighbouring landowners to reduce the intensity if they farm, say, next to a nature reserve, then even if they're not making it into a nature reserve itself, it will be better for wildlife. And if you give everything a buffer on a map, you can start to see that things connect and join up. We've got potential local wildlife sites in the kind of creamy orangey colour, and they're sites that we can see have potential for wildlife, but we haven't done a survey there to accurately map it. So there's a long list of sites we need to get out and have a look at. But a lot of the eastern side of the county could be very valuable for wildlife and could play a role in nature's recovery. And all of these bits are useful because they could be the sort of the catalyst that wildlife moves out into landscape from, if we can get this right. I've got no idea of the time. I think I'm just, how am I doing? Okay, wave at me if I'll have to talk quicker. So as part of the ancient woodland inventory that we looked at, that I mentioned earlier, what we've found really interesting, we've got lots of old maps. So the top left there is an old field map, and the picture underneath is the aerial image as it is today. And you can see when you overlay the outlines of the old woodland parcels that they sometimes stand out or they could be recreated. Now, often in that context, although that might have been a field that they've grown crops in for the last 20 years, the soil still might have woodland species in it, just underneath the cropped area. So if you were prioritising where you should plant trees in Stratford district, focusing on those areas would definitely be better than planting somewhere new. Because if you planted trees there and there is a sort of ancient woodland species in the soil, bluebells and other things like that, they will reappear once you get the woodland conditions right. Bluebells won't appear if they're not sort of, in the soil assemblage. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the sites that we recognise. This goes back to the map I just talked about these local wildlife sites and potential local wildlife sites. So the green areas on that are sites that we've surveyed and we know are good for wildlife, and the orange areas we think are good and need to do a bit more digging. The Wildlife Trust is trying to lead the way with this approach to hitting 30%. So we established a bold ambition of trying to buy 1,000 hectares, or acquire, sorry, 1,000 hectares of new land by 2030 to try and double our nature reserve management portfolio. So far, we've raised 1.6 million, but even if we raise 3 million, you can't buy 30% of Warwickshire with that. And these next few maps really help to identify that. So currently, with our 1,000 hectares, which sounds quite a lot, until you put it on a map and realise it's 0.4% of the area that we currently sort of oversee and try and influence. So, all of the nature reserves that the Warwickshire Wildlife Trust have currently only influence less than 0.5%. So even if we double that, we won't even be hitting 1% of the county's area. So you can't look to try and impact 30% of the county just through managing everything and doing everything yourself. But we've been working at a landscape scale for a while. So we've got a landscape schemes, and that's where my department focuses. We work with other people on their land. We've got the Tame Valley Wetlands up near Coleshill, Dunsmore Living Landscape between Coventry and Leamington. And then the Sherborne Valley project, which is a project we're working on in the city of Coventry on the river there. And if you add those together, it comes to 11%, which still isn't enough. And then in contrast, if you look at how much land across the area is dedicated to agriculture, it's 70%. So it just goes to show that for nature to recover, the Wildlife Trust can do as much as it wants on its own, but it's never going to win that battle. We need to work in partnership with others. We need to work with farmers, with councils, with businesses, with individuals to help bring our wildlife back. And a key change and an evolution of how we're looking to try and do that is through this idea of Team Wilder. So over the last 5 decades, our approach has tended to be to lead from the front and to get people involved, but tending to be directly involved in stuff ourselves. So we might have a project officer who'd come out to a parish and they'd help plant some trees, and then they'd go on and do the next thing. And that's great, and it works really well, but there's only so many people that we have, and you can only do so much of that if you've only got a few people. So Team Wilder is about trying to harness and move people along this journey of caring about nature to actually acting. And there's lots of stats out there, and the stats on the screen there are from Natural England's survey. They've been carrying out surveys of people and their relationship with nature for a while. And this graph shows that on the left-hand side, nearly everyone, 94%, for a range of different characteristics, and don't worry if you can't read the words, basically they value nature. So 94% of people in the world, or sorry, in the UK, when questioned, value nature. And a range of different sort of nature-based values, everyone went, yeah, absolutely, we can see why nature's good. If you then ask them, okay, so you value nature, what do you do in your household to take action to help nature? That then starts to drop off. And you get down to, I usually recycle. 74% of people do that. I walk or cycle when I can. Only 44% of people do that. I usually buy eco-friendly products and brands. Only 27% of people do that. And then you get down further to the right-hand side of the graph with conservation actions. And then that's about, do you volunteer? Do you support environmental causes? And that gets even less and less. So the challenge that we're facing as a society is to take that value action into actual action, because at the moment people say they care, but they're not doing anything about it. So faced with that dilemma, the Wildlife Trust have been thinking, okay, well, how do we solve this? Because this is an emergency. We've got literally less than 10 years, we think, before things start to unravel. And we've been investing in behavioural change research and collaborating with universities and trying to explore how people have done things like moved away from smoking or away from lead petrol in cars and other sort of behavioural changes that had sort of legislative drivers, but also people were compelled to change the way in which they acted. And I was amazed, but the studies show across a range of different things that if you can get 25% of people to change their behaviour, that's enough to create that momentum to then change everybody else. It's not 50%, it's not 60%, it's not 70% you need on your side to do it. You only need 1 in 4 people to make a difference. So if you imagine your street and you don't mow your lawn in May, and everyone looks at you and oh, their lawnmower's broken or whatever. If you can get enough neighbours on your street to do the same thing, up to 1 in 4, what happens then is some people think, I'm missing out on something here. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I'm going to copy them anyway without really understanding why, because it seems like the right thing to do. Other people are going to just follow it because their best mate are doing it and they want to talk about it and they want to feel like part of the club. And other people get to that point where they're starting to feel like they're marginalised because they're the ones not doing it now and they wish they'd done it earlier. So you get to this position where you start to create momentum, partly through intrigue, partly through copy behaviour and partly through various other things that enables people to follow. And then you start to get that point where it's actually awkward if you're not mowing your lawn in May. So put another way, Team Wilder brings people together, each having an individual piece of the jigsaw, and by everyone playing a small part in it, we enable nature to recover. And that's the crucial thing to all this. We're not actually asking for people to change a lot. It's small changes in behaviour, like when just before the pandemic, you know, there was a mass drive towards the single-use plastic reduction. Lots of people just started to change how they approach single-use plastic. The same can be done for the environment. And we've got some examples of that that's already kind of working, and some of it is challenging and some of it is not easy. And it relies from our side in us trying to let go a bit from owning everything that we do. So going back, as I said before, the charities approach, and it's been very successful over the last 5 decades, we've done lots of good stuff, is to get hands-on and involved and do the doing. But there's only so much we can do the doing because we're never going to have the infinite resources we need to hit that 30%. So the idea behind Team Wilder is we inspire and equip and support others to act without us having to be directly involved. So we've got a project called the Arden Farm Wildlife Network, which is led by farmers. It covers the whole of Western Warwickshire. And the farmers suggest what they want to learn about. And then we give them the skills to learn about it. And we try and apply for funding and then let them do it. And one project like that is barn owls. So they've put lots of barn owl boxes across the farming landscape. And now barn owls are breeding on farms they never used to breed on. Now, we didn't tell them that they should focus on barn owls. They wanted to do that. We just gave them the hand to do it. And that's helping barn owls recover without us having to physically put the boxes up ourselves. Another example is the Stratford Riverside project, which is obviously controversial for a lot of reasons. Our approach with that has been to try and be supportive and create that ecological integrity behind the project, but allow others to do the doing. Our old model would have been say, oh, the Wildlife Trust here, we'll sort this out, you step back. But actually, that's not sustainable. We can't do that all the time. We need to be able to enable others to take actions for nature. But in doing so, it's a bit awkward and a bit challenging because you can stand at the side and think, well, it's not quite how we would have done it. But nature can still benefit if we can empower and inspire people to act. Right, last few slides. So hopefully you're thinking, right, okay, I'm ready to go home and change the world now. If you are ready to go home and change the world, there's lots of simple things that you can do. So on our website, if you are internet friendly, you can find right at the top, there's a big green banner that says Team Wilder. And if you click on that, it takes you to lots of these lovely little pictures. Great things to do with your family, with your friends, simple ways in which you can incorporate ideas into your garden or your space or whatever it is you live. So, you know, if you live in a flat, you can do something in a window box. If you've got a garden, you can do something in your garden that's suitable for you. And the challenge and the way in which we're trying to encourage people to think about this is, in some circumstances, you can just dedicate the whole space to nature, but not everything can be a nature reserve. So if you've got a family and a garden that's used by grandkids or kids, then actually some of that needs to be where they can kick a ball around or do whatever else it is they do. So you need to think about how you design the space to allow wildlife to exist alongside other stuff, because that's how it will be sustainable. It's all very good as sort of preaching about how we need to make space for nature. But if we're asking farmers to do that at the expense of growing food, then we're going to run out of food. They need to be able to grow food and help nature rather than doing one or the other. And the same applies to people at a local level. So we've got lots of different advice and guidance. There are leaflets you can download. We've got like hard copy leaflets. Unfortunately, I haven't got any with me tonight, but there's lots available. If I hear you're thinking about going on a trip to Brandon Marsh, we could make lots of those leaflets available at Brandon Marsh if you plan that for later in the year. And then this is a slide that hopefully you can kind of reflect on if these are shared afterwards, which is essentially using the idea of the kind of, hopefully you'll recognize the kind of tube map style that we've gone for. But essentially what it's showing is that everybody can play their part in nature's recovery. So whether you've got a garden pond or you have a golf course or a woodland or a window box or a farm, everyone can play their part in that connected landscape. And it's about those small actions that all add together to allow those species to move. So, in summary, we're going to try and continue to manage the land that we've got. We're also going to try and make more space for nature on other people's land and by acquiring stuff. And we're going to help you guys take action for nature at a scale that we haven't done before. And by doing that, we'll have more people on nature's side, enabling more action for wildlife and creating more space for nature. And that is how we will put nature into recovery. Thank you very much.